For decades, modern life was built on one key assumption: that energy would stay available, affordable, and stable. Oil-powered industrial growth, transportation, global trade, and economic expansion. But as oil prices became more volatile due to wars, geopolitical tensions, supply disruptions, and rising demand, the effects started spreading through the entire economy. Today, those pressures are increasingly showing up in electricity prices. And because electricity powers almost everything around us, from homes and hospitals to factories and digital infrastructure, rising electricity costs don't just affect utility bills. They affect the cost of living. They affect businesses. They affect jobs. They affect political stability. This presentation explores how rising electricity costs are quietly reshaping society from the ground up. Modern civilization runs on energy. Every major system we depend on, transportation, manufacturing, healthcare, food supply, communication, and technology, only works because energy powers it. For more than a century, cheap oil helped fuel economic growth and rising living standards across the world. But there's a hidden problem in that model. When societies become deeply dependent on cheap energy, they also become vulnerable when energy becomes expensive or unstable. And because energy sits underneath almost every part of the economy, instability doesn't stay isolated. It spreads. Higher energy costs eventually show up in food prices, transportation costs, business expenses, and household bills. In many ways, energy is the foundation beneath the entire economic system. Most people think of oil, gas, and electricity as separate things. But in reality, they are deeply connected. When oil prices rise, transportation costs increase. Natural gas prices often rise too. And because many countries still use fossil fuels to generate electricity, power costs also begin climbing. That pressure spreads through supply chains and eventually reaches ordinary households. A factory pays more to operate. A supermarket pays more for logistics. A delivery company pays more for fuel. And consumers end up paying more for almost everything. This is why energy problems don't stay inside the energy sector. They spread through the entire economy like a chain reaction. Electricity is no longer just another utility. It has become one of the most important foundations of modern life. Almost everything depends on electricity. Hospitals, banks, factories, food systems, communication networks, and the internet itself. So when electricity prices rise, the impact spreads everywhere at once. Businesses face higher operating costs. Families lose disposable income. Essential services become more expensive. And because electricity sits behind nearly every product and service we use, rising power costs create a ripple effect across the economy. What starts as a utility issue quickly becomes a cost of living issue. To understand why electricity costs are rising, we need to look at the bigger picture. Oil markets have become increasingly unstable over the years because of wars, geopolitical tensions, supply cuts, global demand shifts, and market speculation. Whenever oil prices spike, the effects spread quickly through the economy. Transportation becomes more expensive. Production becomes more expensive. Shipping becomes more expensive. And eventually, electricity prices rise too. We've seen this pattern many times throughout history. Energy shocks often lead to inflation, economic slowdowns, and public frustration. What people experience as rising electricity bills is often part of a much larger energy story happening behind the scenes. The world is now moving from an industrial economy into a digital one. And digital economies need enormous amounts of electricity. Artificial intelligence, data centers, electric vehicles, smart cities, automation, semiconductor manufacturing. All of these technologies depend heavily on stable electrical power. In the past, oil was the resource that determined economic power. Now, affordable electricity is becoming just as important. Countries that can provide cheap, reliable electricity will likely have major advantages in technology, manufacturing, and innovation. In many ways, electricity is becoming the fuel of the digital age. When electricity costs rise, businesses usually have only a few options. They can raise prices, cut jobs, delay expansion, or move operations somewhere cheaper. At the same time, households are also under pressure. Families spend more on utilities, groceries, transportation, and essentials. That leaves less money for everything else. Over time, this slows consumer spending and weakens economic growth. And when inflation rises too quickly, central banks often increase interest rates to slow the economy down. But higher interest rates create new problems. More expensive loans, weaker housing markets, and reduced investment. So what starts as rising energy costs can eventually affect the entire financial system. One of the biggest long-term risks is that energy costs could deepen inequality. Wealthier households often have ways to protect themselves: solar panels, battery storage, efficient homes, and smart energy systems. But lower-income households usually don't have those options. They remain more exposed to rising electricity prices while also living in less energy-efficient homes. Over time, this creates a growing divide between people who are energy secure and people who are energy vulnerable. And that affects much more than utility bills. It affects health, education, productivity, stress levels, and long-term financial stability. Energy resilience may become one of the defining social divides of the future. When the cost of living rises for long enough, people eventually become frustrated. And electricity prices affect people very directly because they are tied to everyday life. As costs rise, public anger increases, trust in institutions weakens, and political polarization often grows. Governments usually respond with subsidies, rebates, or price controls to reduce pressure on households. But these solutions are expensive and create difficult trade-offs. How do governments keep energy affordable, modernize infrastructure, reduce emissions, and avoid increasing debt all at the same time? That's why energy policy is no longer just an infrastructure issue. It's now closely tied to politics, public trust, and social stability. The world now faces a difficult balancing act. On one side, rising fossil fuel costs are pushing countries toward renewable energy faster than ever before. Solar power, battery storage, and decentralized energy systems are becoming more attractive. But on the other side, people are already struggling with rising living costs. So while societies want cleaner energy, they also want affordable energy. And that creates tension. If the transition becomes too expensive too quickly, public resistance grows. But if the transition moves too slowly, countries remain trapped in volatile fossil fuel markets. This is the energy transition paradox. How do we move toward a cleaner future without creating economic instability along the way? Over time, rising electricity costs may fundamentally change how societies are organized. We're already seeing systems evolve around energy efficiency. Smarter electrical grids, decentralized power generation, battery ecosystems, efficient buildings, and AI-driven energy management. In many ways, rising energy pressure is forcing innovation. Cities, industries, and households are slowly reorganizing around resilience and efficiency. And countries that adapt successfully may become more competitive, more stable, and more technologically advanced in the future. Because in the 21st century, energy policy is no longer just about power generation. It's about economic strength. It's about national security. And increasingly, it's about the future direction of civilization itself. What starts as a rise in energy prices rarely stays there. It spreads outward through the economy, into businesses, into households, into governments, and eventually into society itself. Higher electricity costs don't just affect utility bills. They affect inflation. They affect jobs. They affect political stability. And increasingly, they affect which nations lead and which fall behind in the digital age. At the same time, access to affordable and reliable energy is becoming a new dividing line between resilience and vulnerability. This is why energy is no longer just an infrastructure issue. It has become an economic issue, a social issue, a technological issue, and a geopolitical issue all at once. And as the world becomes more electrified and more digitally dependent, one reality is becoming increasingly clear. The future strength of societies may depend not simply on how much energy they produce, but on whether ordinary people can still afford it. Because in the end, energy affordability may become one of the defining challenges of our time.